Okay, last week we left off having read partially through the journal excerpt from John Wesley's writings, and a portion that his mother wrote to him about how she reared children in their household. Was there an inside joke over here? Just him. Anyway, before we read the next couple of sections, any follow-up commentary, question, or thought from last week? The primary section was conquering the child's will. A few of you give us some summarizing principles there.
I like the example that I think you mentioned of looking to what process happens when somebody's born newly into the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing how what's first broken is the self-will.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing that as like a parallel of giving kind of like some structure or foresight into that process, building it into them. Necessarily like through force, but just wanting to give them a pathway to, to be apt, I guess, to that kind of life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the way you interpret the discipline in that section has a lot to do with how you were raised, unless you are very specifically coming at it with a certain viewpoint in mind, which I was able to do on my second read around.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the first impression, at least I had of that chapter, was in the context in which I was disciplined, which was often through emotion. And in not necessarily positive emotions, reactional emotions to the child. And so I would say that you sharing your context and how you were disciplined by your father with love and patience and never as a reactionary to your whatever you were being disciplined for, I think gives that a lot better context in my mind for how that sort of discipline looks for a child.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously part of the point here is that as you guys think about this, that there, in some future time, that this becomes practical for you in your own home, in your own household, and with your own children. And it's not that you need to necessarily have all of your consequences and responses or measures premeditated. What's the underlying principle in it all that is more indicative to the parent than it is to the child? Did that not make sense?
I remember what you were saying in regards to what matters with the parents and the child. I'm unsure how that relates to what you just said. Well, say that again.
There's an underlying principle here that is the primary of which, although it's being applied to the child, it's actually a representation of the practice of the parent's life.
Self-discipline.
Yeah, discipline, self-discipline. And so that's something that you really need to be developing in life now. If you develop good self-discipline now, good habits in relationship now, good habits in communication for yourself, then those are things that you're going to be able to pass on. And so, what's very interesting about a very young life is that you can't use cognition for communication. You have to use other inputs So we talked about rhythms and frequencies as things that are recognizable. And if your child or children witness you always in a state of expressive it's not about whether you're passionate or not. But again, these are things that can be, you can discern, each one of you here. Everyone here has siblings. Okay? You can discern something that your sibling is trying to communicate apart from the words they're using to communicate it. They can say words or a set of words in such a way that means something very specific that actually may not be connected to the words at all. You can also communicate something that is cognitively understood by the words that you speak, but the tone, the facial expression, or those other inputs with which you combine those words change the meaning of it. And so that means that cognition and language is not the primary export there. It's not the primary means by which what is actually your intention and in your mind is conveyed. And those are the kind of things that you can learn to put into a disciplinary practice now in life and in relationship with other people. And so if you're going to be able to train a mind, that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do if you do not have a trained mind. And so these looking into this is waiting until you have a child is not the right time to think about how to raise a child. And in its true essence, focusing only on how to raise a child is not the only thing that you need to be concerned with. It's connected to a greater way of life. Discipline in a positive and instructive sense begets discipline. And chaos produces chaos in the mind and the heart. So instability sows instability. And stability sows stability. And so those are things that you have this opportunity and the timing of life, the season of life that you are in currently, to learn and to begin to put into practice things that will produce good fruit in your life. And when they have been shown or proven, wisdom is proven by her children to have produced good fruit in your life, then there will be a natural impartation to another generation of life, your actual children. There are some practical things, and that's why we're looking at this. There are certain things that in this writing are somewhat practical, but I'm not sharing this as a how-to, as a bullet-pointed how-to, or an outlined how-to. It's an example of something that points to a greater principle. That being, first of all, the primary principle is that God created humans to be able to receive and respond and benefit from instruction. They need to be shown and taught. The makeup of humans by God's design was one that could learn and then change or transform by and through learning. And one of the very first thing that took Adam and Eve into a trajectory that was going to miss the mark was in how they learned. That you are to learn of me and to become like me, but not in this way. So if you come away from any teaching, and a teaching like this, not today's teaching time, but when you look at the teaching of principles even, and you turn them into something black and white, then we have the great propensity to become very rigid about it. You see, the rigidity of man's thinking, Adam and Eve, initially, was exposed early on too. You know, when the serpent came to Eve, Adam there nearby, and said, "Hey, so I heard you're not supposed to eat any of the fruit in this garden." Well, that was a ridiculous statement, because that's not what was said. Well, what about this particular tree? And then she goes further and says, you know, we're not even supposed to touch it. So she's adding something to that. So there was a certain rigidity to her understanding. What was clear is she didn't understand why. And that was something that they had not gained from the Father, nor had they sought it out. And so this season of your life is a time of life where you are still under what we could call the rod of instruction. The rod in the scripture is very often, that word is used in specific applications, and not as many are something that is the tool or vessel that is used for beating, but rather like a standard. It's like a straight line, but the point is, it doesn't move. There's a standard that comes out. I think on the prophet and the prophetic scriptures, it talks a lot about the rod of the mouth, where they will be ruled with a rod of iron. That's an unchanging, unbendable thing. It's what it's meant to be. It's a straight standard. And there are punitive things that are mentioned in the Bible as well. I think one that we're familiar with is in that scripture in Proverbs that says, "Don't spare the rod," right? But if we put that in a broader context, then what God is really communicating is never lower the bar. Never withdraw the standard from your children. Never change it. It always needs to stay the same. And so self-discipline is applying the rod to yourself. And so you can think of that in the way that Martin Luther did, and he would go in his room and beat himself on the back physically, trying to beat the sin out of himself, but it didn't change him. And so, you know, he's that practice on his part shaped the way that he understood God and God's discipline, but not necessarily in a positive way. The rod of God's mouth, or the rod of his word, is an unchanging standard and way. And so it is wisdom to learn how to apply the rod, how to understand the rod, and how to receive it, and how to administer it as well. I think I had it marked here, but that is Proverbs 13. There's several scriptures in chapter 13. It's worth reading. It's worth reading Proverbs, the whole book of Proverbs, in the perspective of instruction. Father instructing his son. 13:1 says, "A wise son heeds his father's instruction, but a mocker does not listen to rebuke." And then it's toward the end of that chapter where it says that he who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him. So he's careful to give him the right instruction. He's careful to not only explain, but exemplify and outstretch that standard over his life. This is the standard by which you are to learn and to be instructed. Now, we're going to move on in this writing, but before we do that, just briefly, what then is the advantage that we discussed a little bit last time? But let's think about that again. What is the advantage that we give to a young life who is raised under this kind of instruction?
You don't have to deal with it later. Like, it's better to set this standard earlier on. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Talking about the standard? Because I was thinking about it, and like it seems like a more modern way of raising children is to be much more lenient when they're young, and like get harder on them when they're older because they would understand more. But it's obviously the reason that it's so hard when they're older is because the standard was so loose when they were young, right? Like
That's definitely part of it.
I've seen these ridiculous videos just of like, it just when you reminded me of like the talking about a standard and not lowering it once you've said it. Just like parents will take videos of their kids and say like, okay, you get to say one bad word, like just with this really young, but like right, it's just the idea of being so nice and lenient to your children when they're young and then expecting them to be a certain way when they're mature or older, and then it's just not gonna work out, right? Because there's zero foundation, and the foundation that is there is very weak.
I mean, in its root, is anything that we're talking about, are you understanding it to, this is for each one of you, are you understanding this to think that this is indicating, or that I am saying, that you need to be very strict, restrictive, and harsh
No,
with an infant or a
that's
young
not
child?
what I'm trying to.
Oh, I'm not saying
saying.
that that's what you're saying. I'm just asking this question.
That's not what I think. No. I think
Anyone?
that
It's okay if that's part of the just maybe even a struggle in your own mind that you're having. You're not thinking wrong there. I'm just wondering if that's the way anyone's receiving this.
Still unsure with corporal punishment, but that's just thoughts I'm having.
Mm-hmm.
I understand punishment in general, and I think that's very necessary, whether it's strict or not, but corporal punishment is definitely something I still struggle with the correctness of.
Yeah.
Physically beating a child or spanking, whatever you want to call it, whether done in emotion or not.
That is a very. So, like Elijah said, even Suzanne mentions here, there are certain things that a vast majority of parents allow, either in the household or otherwise, their child to do, that they know for a fact that they will have to apply some level of strictness and or discipline for later on. They just choose not to do it. So is it better for the child? And, if there's a struggle there with corporal punishment, how that is measured out is obviously very important. And so, how do we measure that? If we're measuring corporal punishment on the millimeters of skin that are raised when you apply a lash to a child, as if that's the measurement, like we've actually caused a certain level of pain and damage to the body, and that was sufficient for their age. So at 1 or 2 years old, it's 1 millimeter, and the red mark cannot be more than 3 millimeters wide, and you know what I mean, because that would be bringing forth a certain measure of pain. But I may also, that's where you're, not you, but we can draw. There's there has to be certain measurement of corporal. It means touching the flesh. Okay? So if my child is going to harm themselves and I take their hand and move it, and I need to add a little bit of an extra movement so that there's an indication that this is an unsafe or not right thing to do, I have applied corporal punishment. Okay? At any age. And then the gesture itself is an indication of what I'm trying to communicate to the child, right? But there's not any intention on my part to harm the child, to cause pain to the child. But that may change depending on the insistency of that little mind and what they're going to do. And that may reach the point where there is a bit of a warning there that comes through pain receptors, but not being applied to cause harm, so that the mind changes the way that they think about what happens. And that may be yet safer than the 110 volt shock that they receive if I just let them learn the hard way, right? And that's just an easy example about that. But all to say, I do think, because it's kind of what Elijah was saying too, is that there is a sentiment among child rearing that there should never be a certain application of corporal punishment or physical punitive interaction between a parent and a child. And I think that the self-discipline of a parent is probably the major component there in connection to that child. And I think that that's indicated too by what's in this much older writing as well, which is as much as they can bear. And so, like, that sounds like a vague statement, because it's like, if someone wants to define that, like, well, they're still alive, you know, like, I think these are, no, you don't go that far, but you don't go anywhere near that, you know. That's, there's a certain amount of awareness there that I think has also, you know, lacked, you know, Jane, I've heard, obviously, my own parents' experiences and other people's experiences. I mean, I've seen that in a lot of other family environments and whatever else. And I think that the truth of the matter is that the majority of parents don't have enough self-control to administer that type of discipline. That's probably true. And that's why I'm recommending to you now that any measure of instruction in this way really needs to be founded on your own control and self-discipline in life. And one of the advantages of having a marriage partner is that that's something that you are able to witness and observe of one another and help work through and balance those things together with one another. And, you know, that's something that you'll have to figure out in terms of the communication between you and your spouse and what you observe of one another, and maybe having conversations ahead of time about, I mean, good grief, guys, Rachel does that to me still, and it's not because I run around the house with a paddle swinging it at people's heads and rears, you know. I mean, you know, it's, and even in younger years, as self-controlled as I tried to be, there were moments where Rachel would say, "Are you sure that was appropriate?" And so I'm not saying in any way that we have some perfect way of parenting, or even in some ideal exemplary marriage relationship, so as to say we did everything right. But we do communicate about those things. And I've shared those things with Rachel, you know, like, is there something more personal involved in this that's having an impact on the way that you're communicating? And those are hard conversations to have, but they're very necessary conversations. So, you know, a subject matter like this is not so singular that you're going to decide for yourself how you're going to discipline your children or raise and instruct your children. I don't see those two things any differently. Because when I say discipline, I'm not narrowing this down to, are you going to beat your children to the ground or are you going to never touch them? No, I'm thinking of it actually all in the positive manner of instruction. And instruction requires direction. The rod then is what balances that on either side to keep that child in the mind, in the right path, in the right way of thinking. And so, in answer to my previous question earlier, it is of a great advantage for a mind to learn how to be shaped. If it's not used to being shaped, if it's not used to being given direction, then it will always rebel against it. And if we wait, there are very obvious ages in a child's life. The two major ones that we remember are the terrible twos and then the terrible teens, early adolescence. And these are the two big times of life that young people really stretch the borders and challenge the norms and try and see what the limits are. And if you wait until those times to apply discipline, and the mind and heart is not used to that type of directional influence and instruction, well, you're going to have a hard time. That's the whole point here. So and here's the other thing that you need to very much remember, is that a developing mind, an infant, up until the 2 and 3-year-old age is a time of life that the mind, and this is true the adolescent time too, and for the same reasons, because different chemical processes are promoting certain growth processes in the body, but unto different seasons of life. And at that young age, that's one of a huge growth spurt for both the body and the mind, the cognitive, but the relational mind of that child at 2 and 3 years old. They're learning who you are and how you think. And so it actually helps them learn to go to that boundary and discover it. And they need the resistance at that point. But if for the first 2 years of their life, up until that transition time starts to take place, they have never been given any resistance and they've never been given any instruction, then it has a great propensity to be very difficult. It can cause damage. It's like a tender shoot in a greenhouse that has no wind resistance or weather resistance to the plant. Nature shows us by way of plant life that resistance is essential, that adversity is essential to healthy growth. And so it helps the plant stay in a place that it's supposed to be. Well, this is the garden of your house. You have a garden within you, your inner man, your inner life. And if you don't apply discipline to it, then it just grows wild. If you never prune it, it won't produce good fruit. As the apostle says, all discipline seems unpleasant at the time. Anything that is promoting growth is going to seem like it's not promoting growth. But by design, it helps, it creates it right. So what advantage are you giving your child? The advantage that you are giving them is a mind that very early on understands that instruction is not a bad thing. And it yields to it. So back to some of what Elijah was saying, these things are not going to keep you or your child from ever doing anything wrong. what's going to enable them to do is to more quickly yield to and be shaped by good instruction and training instead of rebelling against it, instead of offering so much resistance to it. Go ahead.
Just wanted to share a thought I had while you were talking. Just, I guess, more in how something like that sort of punishment works, like the practical effect of it. It is not, there's something a little more meaningful about it than it just being like this, like the child learns it is kind of a don't do this or else this will happen kind of thing. But what I see something like corporal punishment being is a way to teach a child how to feel. And what I mean by that is it teaches or it opens up something in a child that even words are not even quite able to do in certain instances. Like, not just opens up that's not just talking about teaching them how to feel physically, I'm not talking about that. But it's awakening something in their conscience. You're starting to, it's like, I don't know if this is even a thing you do with a body part that maybe went cold or something, but you kind of like slap it back to bring the blood back up to, and flowing in that part of the body. And obviously the way that this works out advantageously with a young person, a very young person, is that it actually doesn't take very much physical contact or slapping to bring that feeling back. While if that was left cold for a long time, or if the child gets old enough, it takes a lot of slapping to bring the feeling back. But the thing is, that sort of teaching the child to feel is like, the way that it's teaching them is that you are almost substituting what would have been a much worse consequence for their life through a much lesser but very instructory or instructional form of discipline. The most common example is a child reaches out to touch some very, very hot thing because they have no idea that it's going to burn them and significantly injure them. And so you slap the child's hand out of the way, or you yank them aside, which causes them pain and upsets them, but in such a way that they avoid a much worse injury. And you apply that to an action of wrongdoing. They have to learn that every motive, every act of the will that they commit, that it's in life, it is always going to have a consequence. And so what do you think you teach the child when they do something wrong, and you reprimand them kindly and softly, and then you cuddle with them? What does that teach the child about that act of the will that they had been initiated in when they did that bad thing?
And they get the attention they wanted, actually.
They feel validated by it. They wouldn't say, I know I did a wrong thing and that's good. They wouldn't admit that what they did was okay, because obviously their parents just said it wasn't. But the way that that parent treated in what seems to be this really kind, loving, soft-hearted way is it's malforming their ability to perceive, to feel the weight of the direction their will was going. But by the parent in love and not in emotion, because when they're doing it in love, they know that they're doing something that is like substitutionary, if that's even a word. This is what you're getting instead of the much greater consequence of that action and what it would lead to if it became a pattern in your life. And so it's a discipline of that sort is a way that love protects and guards and lessens the consequence of bad behavior. And it is all, when you think of it in terms of it teaching the child to feel, comes across a lot differently to me.
I appreciate that, and it actually brought something to mind. I want to hear what you have to say, Jaden. But Jaden, I actually think that maybe this will be helpful, not to you, but just because I think it's a missing counterpart here. Yeah, I don't think that it was non-existent in their home, but it's not written out at all in this. But it was in my home, and I'll give a real life example of how this works. But the counterpart to forward instruction, let's call it that, is regular affection. And that's not just lovey-dovey, huggy, sweetie, kissy, you know, all the noises that
sound effect.
yeah, I didn't know what sound effects he used. But like,
What the hell?
at the same time, my point is that that's the other side of this, is that there is a regular practice of the communication, that affection that comes to various forms of communication. Speaking, proximity, physical affection, and so that then when you apply something that's not also regularly practiced, and probably more often than even discipline, the disparity is not as known. So like if a child is not also receiving that type of regular input from their parent that is of this more like positive, it's not about non-instructive, but it's about presence and about the display of affection through word and deed and proximity. So then if the child only receives one side, then, that seems to always be, this side that has a rigid nature to it. But maybe I'm not explaining myself that well, but I do know how this worked in Esther's life in particular. Because I can remember when Esther was in the age of, 2 to 3, 2 to 4 years old, and it's not like she was some super, boundary testing child, but she still had things that she wanted and things that she would insist on. But this happened a few times, and there were some times where I think I probably did. I had to do what I did and then leave the room and laugh a little bit. But sometimes it was the opposite on my part. But with Esther, and this is something I want to convey to you about, corporal punishment. If I could hit Esther all the time, I pat my children all the time still, okay? Like that, right? But if I did that to Esther with an intent that she understood, she'd tank. Because I communicated something physically that was met with her understanding of the frequency that I was operating in, that she understood very well non-approval. And it didn't come because she experienced pain, some high level of pain on her flesh, but she felt a lot of pain in her little self. And her whole demeanor, she would cry. And I mean, she would go down, and she was being punished. You see what I'm saying? I didn't have to use a certain instrument. I didn't have to use harshness in any physical sense. But all it took was that change. And then there were times where maybe I administered those things and it didn't catch me humorously, because I'm thinking, man, it's not about her being sensitive. It's about her understanding me. Okay? And then sometimes her response would really hurt my heart a little bit, because she took something more than what I intended, but it had nothing to do with the physical. And so but it was still good for her at the same time. And so there was a statement here that that she wrote, something about as much as both the child and the parent can bear or something like that. Where was it? Oh man, I'm kind of sad that I lost that because I thought it was a really good. I really appreciated it. Oh. Oh, no, not that one.
It's in regards to, for by neglecting timely correction, they will contract a stubbornness and obstinacy, which is hardly ever conquered, and never without using such severity as would be as painful to me as to the child.
Yeah, where is that?
First paragraph of Conquer the Child's Will, close to the second paragraph.
Yeah, without using such severity as would be painful to me as the child. Now, that's the word severe is a pretty heavy word, right? But like in this example with my daughter, like I wasn't physically severe, but like there was this mutual, you know what I mean? Like I know I need to give discipline and instruction to my child, and I know that it's, there's almost an equal thing. And actually, I learned this one time, and then we're going to read. But this was something that in my life, I had a singular experience that defined that forever for me. And it was in an occasion where my dad was, I don't remember what I did. It was moderate. I don't know that there were too many severe things, but moderate was a significant discipline. This was a 3 to 5 spanking moderate situation.
Not Maltese level.
Yeah, it wasn't lighthearted, and I think that even some of those things may have changed over the years, but I know how it was in my formative years was a certain way. But I remember highly anticipating as a child the discipline that I was about to receive. And as my dad would do, we sat on the bed and he had the paddle there and we discussed it. And then he even said, I'm going to give you this many spankings. And I think it was 5, because this was a moderate discipline. And he took the paddle and he handed it to me. And he bent over the bed. And he said, "You do this to me." And I just melted to the floor. There was no way I could do that. And he got really stern. And he made me do it. And I, but not in a kind of way. I was really upset. And he said, "No, I want you to do it hard." And I couldn't do it. And I just cried. And see, there was a part of him that wanted to show me, this is what I feel. This is not a matter of someone wanting to do something to someone else, and I don't think he thought that was my issue. But I think he wanted me to have at least whatever minimal understanding that I could have of what the disciplinary process was about. And I will never forget that. And it's the mind that is there that we communicate to someone else. There was no physical exchange that took place there at all. But it was one of the most meaningful disciplinary experiences that I ever had. So this is not this is not a Here's how to do things. It's how do we convey the right way of thinking to our child, and at the earliest age, the best way to do that is to help shape the mind and break the will. Because once the will is submissive and yielding, then it's not that it will never make a mistake or test a boundary. It's that it will very easily and quickly come into alignment. And so, because you are in essence God to your child, they will not understand God or be able to interact with God in a certain way until a certain point in their life. And until that point, God has given you positional stewardship to be representative of His own heart and His own ways, so that your child learns how to lay His will down. And yeah, that's a huge advantage. Huge advantage. Okay, let's continue to read. Oh, we went through some time. Let's read the next section. I didn't think we'd go through this for 3 weeks, but why not? Why don't I have Haley, will you read this next, are you okay to read this next section for us?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. They had nothing they cried for.
The children of this family were taught, as soon as they could speak, the Lord's Prayer, which they were made to say at rising at bedtime constantly, to which, as they grew bigger, were added a short prayer for their parents and some collects, a short catechism, and some portion of scripture, as their memories could bear. They were very early made to distinguish the Sabbath from other days, before they could well speak or go. They were as soon taught to be still at family prayers and to ask a blessing immediately after, which they used to do by signs before they could kneel or speak. They were quickly made to understand that they might have nothing they cried for, and instructed to speak handsomely for what they wanted. They were not suffered to ask even the lowest servant for aught without saying, "Pray give me such a thing," and the servant was chid if she ever let them omit that word. Taking God's name in vain, cursing and swearing, profaneness, obscenity, is that the right? Obscenity, rude, ill-bred names were never heard among them. Nor were they ever permitted to call each other by their proper names without the addition of brother or sister. None of them were taught to read till 5 years old, except Kezzy, in whose case I was overruled, and she was more years learning than any of the rest of them had been in months. The way of teaching was this. The day before a child began to learn, the house was set in order, everyone's work appointed them, and a charge given that none should come into the room from 9 till 12, or from 2 till 5, which, you know, were our school hours. One day was allowed the child wherein to learn its letters, and each of them did in that time know all its letters, great and small, except Molly and Nancy, who were a day and a half before they knew them perfectly, for which I then thought them very dull. But since I have observed how long many children are learning the horn book, I have changed my opinion. But the reason why I thought them so then was because the rest learned so readily. And your brother Samuel, who was the first child I ever taught, learned the alphabet in a few hours. He was 5 years old on February 10. The next day he began to learn, and as soon as he knew the letters, began at the first chapter of Genesis. He was taught to spell the first verse, then read it over and over, till he could read it offhand without any hesitation. So on the second, and so on, till he took 10 verses for a lesson, which he quickly did. Easter fell low that year, and by Whitsuntide he could read a chapter very well. For he read continually and had such a prodigious memory that I cannot remember ever to have told him the same word twice.
So a little bit about the exercise of their learning. So any thoughts on that? Any observations about how they did things? Maybe some things principally that are notable? Anybody know what Whitsuntide is?
It's like within the week or something.
Yeah, by the week's end.
What's the horn book?
The Horn Book is like a little academic book that must have been used during this time, probably on grammar.
Was she saying Samuel was her firstborn?
Yeah.
Okay. That's very funny.
That's what?
That's just very common for firstborns to be.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, and I can really appreciate her even saying I've changed my opinion about certain things because what I thought this way, and obviously the Wesleys had quite a number of children. I don't know how many it was. Does anybody look that up? Anyway.
Yeah, at least 4 or 5.
Yeah, I think it was more than that. And so, there was a learning curve that happened with each, because it's funny because she'll say something like she did early on in this section where she's like, they all learned it this way except for so. And any child can do this except for Kesey, and you'll see poor Kesey, whoever this was in the family, she was always slow to everything, the exception to the rule. But here you have a mother that was seeing, oh, this isn't all the same and it can't all be applied the same. But that she also saw certain. How many kids did they have?
25.
Okay.
Oh, it said 19.
Susanna Wesley was the youngest of 25.
No, she only 18.
So that's how many children she had. Susanna had 19 children.
19?
9 died of it.
9
died of it.
10. So she raised 10 children. She had 19 total. Unfortunately, that was not an uncommon thing in that day to lose children at a very young age because of illness and other things. So. Okay, what else?
I thought it was kind of cool how they started the learning process for the child, like making it kind of a notable thing or something that was taken with some kind of severity of like the first day of learning. It's not, I can almost, it's not the way we did it exactly, but I still remember the first day that we started learning subjects. I remember that day. I actually remember what we did as well, and Mom teaching us. It's like a very clear memory for me, and I think that's because it was something that was set apart and something that was intentional. I think I like that.
So this is kind of another level. So we've gone from the state of infanthood and to early toddler age. And what's focused on in that early season? What's the primary focus?
Speaking?
No, I mean, we just discussed it for the most of the class. What's the primary focus principally for a parent in that first stage of life?
Discipline.
Discipline and breaking of the will. But now we're coming into a stage of greater cognition and therefore what? Formal instruction. Now that doesn't separate us from the regular practice of discipline and the control of the will, self-will and otherwise, but now we're going to add, as Elijah described it, a set apart time. And they clearly did that, right? I'm not saying you have to have their schedule, but I think schedules are very important in this light. Why? Because they make a separation in the mind. So what's the underlying principle? Disciplining the mind. When the mind is prepared, when you set a time apart, then the mind is used to, it's the discipline applied to the mind. Oh, this is learning time, right? So the mind thinks differently about what it's doing. You can, Elijah, tell me about or Jay, when you have a certain time that you're going to work out, you know, you guys have both done exercise in a very regimented way.
And yes, Jaden's better to ask.
Okay. Is there not a mindset there?
Yes, for sure.
That's a discipline. You have to think a certain way to do something that you don't want to do, right? That's self-discipline. So you're teaching self-discipline. And you're teaching it to a mind that's very malleable and doesn't have boundaries and doesn't understand those parameters. But when you begin to make them subject to those parameters, they begin to understand those things. So there may be other things like learning something at the, how to cook at the grill that you're like, oh man, I gotta put this, Elijah's got his game face on a summer day before he goes to Granny's to cook at the grill. And he may not always think positively about that, but when he gets there, he does a really good job because he puts his mind to it to do it in a certain way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You have to discipline yourself. And I think that those are the things that you guys have said in the past, you haven't done this, so you don't know what it's like to apply this kind of discipline. But we've all had certain disciplines in life where we know, we understand what that's like. And again, when we're enabling, we need to see this all as enablement and helping in development. When we're helping a young mind develop in such a way so as to be able to receive the things that will benefit them the greatest, then it's not all about candy canes and lollipops and fun times all the time. No, they need to understand that the majority of life and their experience in their young, inexperienced life needs to be that the majority of life fits into this arena. Does that mean that there's never a time for leisure? No, of course not. But that's not the majority of life. So there's a similar discipline that I communicated with you guys about even your finances. Once you're able to be a receiver of and then an earner of monetary gain, you need to have a certain mindset, a discipline about what that's for. So with my children, I said, okay, this much to savings, tithe, and personal money, et cetera, however that's all split up. But I wanted to do that in a way that was more realistic to the realities of life, and not just to the, worldly life, but to responsibility and stewardship. And you need to think, if we are raised to think, looking at finances, if we are raised to think that everything that we earn is ours, well, man, the world's going to be a hard place for us to live in. Because we're going to find out that, well, no, you can't live anywhere for free. You can't drive anywhere for free. You can't eat for free anywhere. You can't do all those things. But if we learn early, I spent all this time, I earned this much, and I only get to use this much, and then when that becomes a reality for us, then we're like, we don't really feel like we're being robbed of anything. Whereas if we were never taught those things, if I didn't teach my children in a certain way that, well, this is where most of your money goes, then when they have to face that, they're going to say, what we hear an entire generation of millennials a few years ago saying, we don't like adulting. We don't want those responsibilities. We don't want people to take those things from us. We don't want whatever else. We just want to do what we want and be what we want and go where we want and do what we want, so. Undisciplined minds. And those were some of the latter proponents of, don't ever give instruction to your child in this way because you're going to harm them. It's not what they want. And we have an entire generation of young people who are putting a lot of unrealistic demands on other people and very unwilling to take any culpability or responsibility for their own. So you guys are going to stand out in the generation as those who are responsible, and not just with your time and your money, but with your relationships and with your family and with your reason for living. And that's going to be pretty significant to see. So, all right. Well, we will finish there and pick up next time.